Princess Anne did not soften the words, and she did not ask the palace for permission to make them easier to hear. In one astonishing announcement, the Princess Royal declared that when William's era begins, Camilla will hold no governing influence, no advisory authority, and no private power over the future king's royal household. Britain froze. Camilla's future had just been defined publicly and brutally. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne held the room calmly, making the declaration even more severe. The royal household, the advisors, officials, and staff who support a monarch's duties would belong to William alone, and she stated that Camilla would have no real power inside it. That mattered because the Queen Consort had spent years beside Charles, hearing private discussions and living close enough to authority that her presence carried quiet weight. Now, that closeness had been cut away from the next reign in a single sentence. William did not interrupt. He kept his hands still as his aunt gave public language to a boundary he had struggled to define. The prince knew his future reign could not inherit every arrangement built around his father. Yet hearing Anne say it so bluntly forced the conflict into the open. Across the palace, Camilla heard the words from an aide. She lowered her teacup, missed the centre of the saucer, and the crack of porcelain stopped the room cold. The Queen Consort stared ahead, shocked less by her reduced influence than by the certainty with which her future had been described. Charles felt the danger immediately. The phrase "no advisory authority" struck the king because advisory authority meant trusted access to offer guidance around royal decisions, and his sister's wording sounded precise. The monarch knew Anne was not speaking from instinct alone. She had discussed William's future structure directly with him, through a recorded private family conversation preserved in written notes, and the future king had refused to challenge her wording. That silence carried its own verdict. Anne rose when the briefing ended, but William stayed behind. He waited until the final aide left, then asked for one sealed file from family storage. Charles watched him carefully. The Princess Royal paused at the door because she knew which file he meant. Months earlier, that collection of notes had quietly divided her from Camilla, and now William was ready to read it again. As William opened the file, Anne had forced back into the light. The announcement suddenly looked less like a warning about the future, and more like the consequence of something Camilla had already done. Behind Anne's thunderous announcement were three people carrying three very different fears. Camilla feared becoming irrelevant, William feared inheriting a divided household, and the Princess Royal feared that silence would allow an old pattern to survive into a new reign. This was no longer simply about rank or royal etiquette. It was about trust, memory, and the terrifying question of who would stand closest to the crown when Charles was no longer there. Anne remained beside William after the briefing, her expression controlled but her purpose unmistakable. The royal household, the advisors, officials, and staff who support a sovereign would one day answer to him, and she believed that structure had to begin with firm boundaries. The Princess Royal had never cared for ceremonial comfort when continuity was at risk. To her, silence was not kindness. Silence was permission. William lowered his voice and admitted what he feared most. The prince did not want his first years as king consumed by battles inherited from his father's household. He wanted loyalty without pressure, family without hidden conditions, and a reign that began with his own judgment. Anne listened without interrupting. Then she asked him to remember the Windsor table incident. The phrase changed his expression at once. Camilla carried a different fear. Her royal life had been built beside Charles, close to private conversations and decisions that made her feel secure. Now, the coming reign threatened to remove the access through which she had measured her place. The Queen Consort told the king that Anne had reduced decades of service to one humiliating sentence. Charles reached for her hand, but she pulled away before he could touch it. Charles felt trapped between loyalty and succession. The monarch called his sister privately and asked whether she was protecting William or punishing Camilla. Anne refused to discuss the sealed file over the telephone, explaining only that its contents came from a documented family account written after the Windsor incident. Her refusal unsettled him more than any accusation could have done. William understood then that the file held more than old tension. It contained the original notes from the night when a private conversation crossed into pressure. When Anne decided that his future could not be quietly arranged around him, he ordered the papers brought from family storage and waited alone as the request was carried out. For the future king, reopening them meant confronting not merely Camilla's ambition, but his own long silence and the cost of allowing fear to speak first. Those notes would take William back to one particular evening at Windsor, the moment Anne later described as the point when concern became certainty. Months before Anne stunned Britain, there had been one dinner at Windsor that the family never discussed publicly. The table had been cleared. Charles had retired early. William believed the conversation was over. Then Camilla asked him to remain seated and began speaking about appointments, access, and the shape of his future household. Anne heard enough from the adjoining room to understand one thing immediately. A boundary had been crossed. William first treated the exchange as family advice. The prince assumed Camilla was speaking from experience, offering thoughts shaped by years beside Charles. But the Windsor table incident, the private post-dinner conversation that later became central to the family dispute, changed the moment she placed a handwritten list before him. Several advisors were named. Existing consultation arrangements were mentioned. Then the Queen Consort said continuity would be easier for everyone. William felt the room tighten around those words. He asked whether Charles had approved the discussion, and Camilla did not answer immediately. The pause was brief, but to the future king, it felt enormous. He asked again. She said the king valued stability, yet she still did not say that he had authorized the list. That silence damaged something deeper than trust. It made William wonder whether his future was already being arranged before he had chosen its shape himself. Anne heard the change in their voices and entered. The Princess Royal saw her nephew standing while Camilla remained seated beside the names, and anger moved through her at once. William looked cornered inside what had begun as a private family evening. The Queen Consort insisted she was protecting stability. Anne stepped forward, took the paper from the table, folded it once, and asked why a future monarch was being handed advisors before he had selected his own. Camilla rose sharply. She argued that experience should not be thrown away simply because one reign ended and another began. Anne answered that at session, the moment a new monarch takes the throne, did not transfer personal influence automatically. William said nothing, but his silence now felt different. He was listening, measuring, and remembering every word. William wrote a short documented account later that night. He described the list, the questions, and the pause after Charles's name was mentioned. The prince handed those notes to Anne for safekeeping, and she sealed them with the paper from the table. That account became the first document in the file he had now reopened. Camilla learned the notes had resurfaced before midnight. She did not call William. She demanded to see Anne face to face. The next meeting would strip away every careful royal phrase because Camilla was no longer prepared to be discussed in another room, and Anne was no longer prepared to retreat. There were no aides inside the room when Camilla arrived, and Anne had deliberately left the long conference table untouched, except for one folded sheet of paper. The Queen Consort did not sit. Neither did the Princess Royal. For several seconds, the two women simply stared at one another across the silence. Then Camilla asked the question that had been burning since the announcement. "Who gave you the right to decide my future?" Anne did not raise her voice. She pointed to the handwritten list and made one thing clear. She was not changing Camilla's title or erasing her place beside Charles. The future household, the advisors and officials who would support William as sovereign, had to belong to the next king alone. The Princess Royal was drawing a boundary around authority because proximity to one monarch could not become automatic influence over another. Camilla's anger sharpened. She accused Anne of waiting years for the perfect moment to humiliate her, to reduce decades of duty to a warning about power. The Queen Consort said she had stood beside Charles through hostility, suspicion, and relentless judgment. Then she pushed a chair backward with one hand and demanded whether any of that service mattered. Anne remained still. She answered quietly that service beside one king did not create power over the next. The Princess Royal said humiliation was not the issue. Pressure was. William had personally told her, during a documented private conversation, that the Windsor exchange had made him feel as though his reign was being planned around him rather than by him. Anne watched Camilla carefully as those words landed. Camilla insisted Charles knew she valued continuity. She said the king understood her fear of losing experienced advisors and trusted channels when William's era began. Anne stepped closer to the table and asked whether he had authorized the list. The Queen Consort hesitated. Anne asked again. Camilla repeated that Charles knew her views. She still did not say he had approved the names. The omission changed everything. The Princess Royal folded the paper once more and told her that concern became interference the moment William was presented with a structure he had never requested. Camilla's expression hardened, but behind the anger was something more fragile. Fear. Not simply fear of losing influence, but fear of becoming irrelevant when her husband's reign ended. The meeting broke apart before either woman could say more. Charles had requested to see them separately. The king had finally received William's written account of the Windsor incident, and he wanted answers without Anne and Camilla in the room together. Once Charles read his son's own words, the battle stopped being a feud between two women. It became a question of what the king himself had allowed to happen. Charles read William's account twice. On the second reading, he removed his glasses, placed them beside the file, and did not speak for nearly a minute. The king was not looking at gossip or family accusations. He was reading his son's description of feeling pressured about a reign that had not yet begun. Suddenly, Anne's announcement was no longer the most painful thing in the room. William's silence before it was. Charles understood what the future household truly meant. The royal household, the advisors, officials, and staff who support a sovereign would eventually answer to William, not to the loyalties built around his father. The monarch had always known succession would transfer authority, but he had not expected the emotional separation to begin before his reign ended. Anne had simply given public force to a boundary the prince had already started drawing in private. Charles asked William to meet him alone. The king wanted no aids and no prepared language. He looked at his son and asked why he had never come to him after the Windsor dinner. William waited before answering. The future king said he did not want his father's final years consumed by another family confrontation, another painful choice between Camilla and someone else he loved. Charles felt the words land heavily. He wanted to protect the queen consort from public isolation. Yet he could no longer pretend that marital loyalty gave him the right to shape his son's future authority. William then revealed, through the documented private account, that Anne had once offered to keep the notes sealed forever. The Princess Royal would have buried the matter. He had recently authorised her to use them only after Camilla again raised the subject of future household continuity. William's voice stayed calm. Camilla would be treated with dignity. She would not be insulted, erased, or pushed from family life. But the queen consort would not choose advisors, attend governing household meetings by assumption, or act as a private channel into the prince's decisions. Governing household meetings, private working discussions where senior royal responsibilities and staff matters are handled, would operate under his authority alone. Charles lowered his eyes. The monarch finally understood that William was not seeking revenge. He was protecting the beginning of his own reign before anyone else could define it for him. That truth made the decision harder, not easier. Charles now had one task left. Camilla was waiting for him to defend her, and the king knew he could not. For Camilla, the cruelest blow was still to come, because Anne had made the announcement. But Charles would be the man forced to confirm that it would stand. Camilla expected Charles to close the door, dismiss Anne's announcement as overreach, and promise that the matter would be corrected. Instead, the king remained standing beside the fireplace and asked her to sit. She knew from his voice that something had changed. Then he said the words she had feared since William's name first became inseparable from the future. "I cannot give you authority in a reign that will not be mine." Camilla stared at him in disbelief. The next royal household, the advisors, officials, and staff who would serve William as sovereign, would be shaped by the future king alone. Charles confirmed he would not challenge that decision, turning Anne's declaration into an accepted family reality. The queen consort would retain respect, protection, and ceremonial consideration, meaning she could still be recognised and included at important royal occasions. But the private channels that once kept her close to decisions were closing. Camilla asked whether decades beside Charles now meant nothing. Her voice remained controlled, but the pain beneath it was impossible to hide. The king answered that those years belonged to their life and his reign. They did not belong to William. She sat completely still, removed a ring, turned it once between her fingers, and placed it back without looking at him. Charles then admitted the truth that changed the room again. He had never authorised the Windsor advisor list. The monarch knew his wife cared deeply about continuity, but he did not know she had placed specific names before William. Camilla looked up sharply. For the first time, she understood why Anne had treated the incident as more than an awkward family conversation. Camilla finally broke her silence during the private conversation with Charles. She confessed that fear had driven her. The queen consort believed William might remove everyone connected to the king's household and leave her surrounded by strangers when the next era began. She had imagined doors closing, familiar voices disappearing, and her own place shrinking until she became little more than a memory from Charles's reign. Charles listened without interrupting. The king had expected anger. Instead, he heard fear. That confession did not restore Camilla's influence, but it exposed the wound beneath her attempt to secure it. Later, he relayed her words to Anne during a documented private call. Anne heard the account and fell silent. The Princess Royal had seen pressure, interference, and crossed boundaries. Now she saw something else. She requested one final private conversation, not with Camilla, but with William. Yet in the silence after Camilla's confession, Anne began to see something she had nearly missed. Beneath the struggle for influence was a woman terrified of disappearing. Anne met William without aides, folders, or advisors. For the first time since the announcement, there was no official language between them. She asked him one question. Did you want Camilla powerless because you feared her influence, or because anger had made exclusion feel easier? William looked away before answering. The future king had spent days defining authority. Now his aunt was forcing him to define something far harder, his intention. William admitted the decision itself had not changed. The prince would choose his own advisors, control access to his decisions, and shape the household that would serve his reign. His royal household, the staff and trusted officials who would support him as sovereign, could not begin with inherited pressure. But he did not want Camilla treated as an enemy. He did not want her erased from family life simply because she would hold no authority over him. William then spoke more honestly. The Windsor incident had revived an old fear that people surrounding the crown would always try to decide matters before he had the chance to speak. The future king told Anne during their private recorded conversation that the list of advisors had made him feel managed before his reign even existed. She listened carefully. For him, the issue had never been one sheet of paper. It was the fear of losing his own voice. Anne finally admitted her own mistake. The Princess Royal said her announcement had been intentionally severe because she believed only unmistakable words could stop another private negotiation. She wanted the boundary understood immediately. Yet, after hearing Camilla's confession through Charles, she feared her language had wounded the Queen Consort beyond what was necessary. Anne had defended William's freedom, but she now questioned whether she had confused firmness with cruelty. William remained quiet before giving his answer. No authority, no automatic access to decision-making, no assumption that years beside Charles created influence over the next sovereign. But Camilla would have personal dignity and a defined place within the family. She would not be publicly destroyed to make his reign look stronger. Anne understood the distinction at once. The Princess Royal offered to deliver it personally. But William asked her to do something more. He wanted Camilla to hear clearly that this was not an apology for the boundary. It was proof that the future king was not seeking revenge. William then stopped his aunt before she left. Speculation was turning a family boundary into a public war. The palace, the royal institution, and the officials who manage formal communication needed to issue one final clarification. By morning, Britain would no longer be guessing what Anne's announcement meant, and the exact wording would ignite a reaction far beyond the palace gates. The country woke to 6 words printed in letters so large they seemed impossible to escape. No power in William's era. Anne's announcement had moved from a royal family crisis to a national obsession. Broadcasters debated succession, loyalty, and the limits of influence. Yet inside the palace, Camilla was not watching the arguments. She was reading one final clarification from William and discovering that,